tin was cold, dented at the rim. The label still read, "Strawberry Preserve." It was the spring of 1915. Somewhere on the Western Front, a section of British trench had just been overrun. German assault troops had punched through the line in under 3 minutes, seized 40 yards of trench, and were already moving along the communication sap toward the next position. The men who had been holding that ground were either dead, retreating, or pinned behind a traverse they couldn't hold much longer. The nearest supply point was too far. The officers were down. The bombers, the specialists trained specifically to clear trenches with grenades, were gone. What remained was a handful of infantrymen, a sergeant with a fuse cutter, and a crate of jam tins packed with gun cotton and scrap iron. That tin in his hand was the only explosive between his section and collapse. He had roughly 4 seconds once the fuse caught. The trench, now filled with enemy troops moving in the dark, was 25 yards away. He lit it. This is the story of the improvised grenade, of the men who built them under fire, rationed the fuses by the inch, and used them to do what trained bombers, issued equipment, and the high command's planning had completely failed to provide. It is not a story of brilliant invention. It is a story of desperate necessity and the stubborn refusal to give ground to a better-equipped enemy, with nothing more than a ration tin, a length of burning cord, and whatever a man could find in the mud.
God damn it.
The war no one expected to last beyond Christmas had been frozen into 2 parallel walls of earth by the autumn of 1914. The generals had planned for maneuver. They had not planned for this, for a kind of fighting that belonged to a different century, where the decisive weapon was not the rifle, not the artillery barrage, but a small explosive thrown at close range into a ditch full of men. The British Army entered the war with exactly one type of grenade in its inventory, the Mark I, a long-handled percussion device that detonated on impact. It cost over £1 to manufacture. It was also unreliable, difficult to throw in the close quarters of a trench, and liable to go off if it grazed the parapet on the way over. The entire British Expeditionary Force had fewer than 1,000 of them. Field Marshal French requested 4,000 per week from the War Office. He received 70. The Germans had no such problem. They had entered the conflict in August 1914 with 70,000 hand grenades in reserve and another 100,000 rifle grenades behind them. Their stick bomb, the steel hand granate, was purpose-built for exactly this kind of fighting. A timed fuse, a wooden handle that extended throwing range, and a concussion charge effective in the confined geometry of a trench. In the opening battles on the Western Front, British units holding sections of captured trench discovered very quickly what it meant to be outbombed. An observer from the Royal Engineers, Lieutenant P. Neame, left an account from the fighting at Neuve-Chapelle that describes the sensation with precision that no training manual ever matched. A black object the size of a cricket ball sailed over the parapet, landed behind him, and detonated with a sound he described as a terrific bang and the whine of whirling bits of metal. Around him, men from the West Yorkshire Regiment were down. The bombing sergeant who remained told him their own grenades were duds. The fuses wouldn't catch, and the German stick bombs were already outranging everything they had left. To be in that trench, without grenades that functioned, while the other side had them in abundance, the improvisation began almost immediately. It had to. The instinct was logical and grim. If the supply chain could not deliver a weapon, the men would build one. The material was already present in every trench in France and Belgium. The British soldiers' daily ration included preserved beef and jam, both packed in cylindrical tins of roughly similar dimensions. Empty and cleaned, or sometimes not even cleaned. Those tins became the raw material of a weapons program that no general had authorized and no ordnance factory had designed. The recipe was brutal in its simplicity. Pack the tin with gun cotton or dynamite. Fill the remaining space with scrap metal, nails, stones, spent cartridge casings, fragments of wire, anything with mass and edge. Thread a length of Bickford safety fuse through the lid, connect it to a detonator seated in the explosive charge, and seal the top. Each inch of fuse burned for approximately 1¼ seconds. Cut the fuse to length, light it, throw it, and do not miss. What emerged was called without ceremony. The production was collective and constant. In dugouts behind the line, men assembled them in shifts. The fuse length was critical. Too long and the enemy could throw the bomb back before it detonated. Too short and it went off in the thrower's hand. The official publication notes from the front dedicated specific attention to this calculation. It was the kind of technical detail that only mattered if you were the one holding the lit end. By the late spring of 1915, the improvised grenade factory at ANZAC Cove in Gallipoli was producing roughly 200 bombs per day. On the 7th of August alone, 54 men assembled hundreds of jam tins for the assault on Lone Pine, one of the most brutal close-quarters actions of the entire campaign. They had almost no issued grenades. The tins were all they had. Now, if you want to go deeper on what the official histories never fully documented, the full accounts, the tactical details, the cost paid by individual units, there's a free guide in the pinned comment below. It covers real cases written out in full, with sources, worth 2 minutes of your time. The geometry of trench warfare made the grenade the decisive weapon in a way that generals trained on open-field tactics had not anticipated. A rifle was nearly useless around the bends of a communication sap. A bayonet required you to expose yourself at close range to a man who had the same idea. But a grenade thrown around a traverse, the earthen zigzag built into trench systems specifically to contain explosions, could kill without line of sight. It could clear a dugout, collapse a position, force men into the open. When German assault troops breached a section of trench, the question of who held it 2 minutes later came down almost entirely to who had grenades and who could use them. The defenders who had none were not simply outgunned. They were structurally helpless against an enemy who moved through the trench system methodically, dugout by dugout, bend by bend. This was the reality the bombing sergeant at Neuve-Chapelle had tried to explain in the seconds before the next stick bomb came over. It was the reality that drove units to improvise, to stockpile, to pull apart supply crates looking for explosive material and fuse wire. It was the reality that made a jam tin, hot, crude, fused with a cut length of cord and packed with whatever fit. Time was measured in feet. The Germans moved in pairs, with the stick bomb thrower working the angles while the second man guarded against counter-movement. The British and ANZAC response, when it existed, mirrored the structure. A bomber, a carrier, and bayonet men to cover the thrower. The jam tins went around the traverse first. If they worked, if the fuse had been cut right, if the explosive charge was seated correctly, if the tin held together long enough to reach the next bend, the concussive force in the confined space was significant. The scrap metal moving at velocity in an enclosed trench was not something a man survived cleanly. 2 or 3 tins thrown in rapid succession could stop a German bombing advance cold, buy the time needed for more men to move up, and give the surviving defenders enough room to re-establish a defensible position. If the tins didn't work, if the fuse was wet, if the detonator failed, if the crimping was off, the men were left holding an inert tin in a trench that was still being cleared from the other end. That happened too. The accounts are honest about it. The improvised bomb was always in short supply, always imperfect, and always potentially dangerous to its maker. The ANZACs threw Turkish grenades back when they had nothing else. Some of those grenades detonated in transit. The price of the improvised solution was paid in the same currency as everything else in that war. In men, and in the specific kind of damage that a metal fragment moving fast through confined space does to a human body. What the jam tin demonstrated, what it proved in the mud of the Western Front and the rocky ground of Gallipoli, was something the General Staff had not fully calculated when they planned for a war of movement. The soldiers' capacity for improvisation under existential pressure was not a backup option. It was, in the first year of the war, the primary line of defense against an enemy who had come equipped for exactly this kind of fighting. The bomber with his stack of jam tins was not supplementing the official weapons system. He was replacing it. The Mills bomb arrived in May of 1915 and changed the arithmetic. Designed by William Mills, its serrated iron body was purpose-built to fragment on detonation, and its lever and pin mechanism gave the thrower reliable time control. By the end of the war, 75 million Mills bombs had been used. It became the definitive British grenade and remained in service for decades after the armistice. The jam tin was officially withdrawn from service as supply caught up with demand. But for almost a year, from the autumn of 1914 through the summer of 1915, the war in the trenches had been held together in critical moments by improvised bombs built from ration tins, by men who had not been trained as engineers and were not equipped as specialists, by sergeants who cut fuses by instinct and lit them with whatever was burning, by a logic so simple it required no manual. The tin goes over the traverse, the fuse burns, the trench is either cleared or it isn't, and you find out which in 4 seconds. The German bombing sergeant at Neuve-Chapelle had said the British bombs were duds. He was right that morning, but the British had not stopped building them. By the time the proper grenades arrived, the men who had held the line with jam tins had already taught the army something it had failed to learn before the war: that the decisive weapon in a trench was the one that actually existed in your hand, right now. Not the one on order from a factory 300 miles away. The trench was not always held, but when it was, more often than anyone in high command cared to record, it was held with a tin, a fuse, and a man willing to light it.